Well, thanks for the pointer. Okay, so we should restart, I would say. Thank you all for coming to join us here in person and online. First of all, acknowledgement of country. So this event is taking place in the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation. We pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge the importance of indigenous knowledge in academia. Please accept our apology that Michele can't be here in person as it was announced, but Michele has been very unwell since this morning. It's definitely not COVID, but it's still thanks for the generosity, Michele, for joining us from your hotel room. We really appreciate your effort. And we also want to thank Professor Alison Young from Criminology. So Alison is hosting Michele in Melbourne this week. So today, Michele is going to talk about politics of home and homelessness. I'm sure Michele Lancione is a familiar name if you're working in critical housing and urban studies areas. Still, I want to mention a few highlights here to set the context. So Michele is a professor of economic and political geography at the Politecnico di Torino, Italy, and visiting professor of urban studies at the University of Sheffield, United Kingdom. Michele is a co-founder and editor of the Radical Housing Journal and corresponding editor at the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. Abdul Malik Simon, who is also a good friend of InfUr. So with Abdul Malik Simon, Michele co-directs the Beyond Inhabitation Lab that facilitates collective study around the shifting terrain and politics of inhabitation globally. And since its inception back 2 years ago, it has been a source of inspiration for many of us across the globe who are interested in radical theories. So Michele currently directs a 5-year European Research Council project entitled Inhabiting Radical Housing and a 4-year Italian Ministry of Universities research project entitled Precarious Housing in Eastern Europe. And Michele has numerous scholarly publications on urban inhabitation, homelessness, and radical housing. His qualitative work offers a critical approach to home and homelessness, focusing on relational reading on processes of dispositions and inhabitations in contemporary cities. And his most recent book that we read as part of a reading group organized by the University of Sydney, which is titled For a Liberatory Politics of Home, published from the Duke University Press. And as hinted in our seminar poster, Michele is going to unpack that book into the seminar. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Michele. Welcome, Michele.
Thank you, Ash. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Okay, thank you, Ash. I would like to thank you. I would like to thank Kim, Crystal, and Damien for organizing today's talk. I would like to thank, in particular, Alison for inviting me for the beautiful workshop that we had yesterday, which is going to stay with me for a long time. And I would like to apologize to all of you for not being in the room. But again, I don't feel well. I didn't sleep. I had fever, so it's better if I stay in this hotel room, which is extremely silly, consider that I traveled to arrive in Melbourne to see you. But this is what it is. So I'm gonna share my screen, and I go straight into the presentation, and then we can have some time for conversation at the end. Can you see my screen, Ash?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So now I'm just going to go straight into it. So the book I'm going to talk to you about today is essentially born out of a profound dissatisfaction with how issues of home and homelessness are dealt with in scholarship, in activism, in policy. This is a dissatisfaction related to the fact that housing is mobilized always as a technical fix, as the ultimate endpoint of policy, but too little is said around the politics of habitation that housing engenders. What about the ways in which the violence of how we inhabit the planet not only creates forms of dispossession, but also constitutes homes that require violence to stand? Are those homes worth defending? So my book deals primarily with Italy. It's situated in Italy, in the Italian colonial history, but the argument that I'm making around the inner violences of home extends beyond that context, at least methodologically. So this argument have to do with the ways in which what houses are made to do, and with the inner violence constituting many projects of home and belonging. We learn from Palestine, even in this sense. The problem there is not just one of domicides, as the UN Rapporteur for the Right to Housing rightly affirms, but there is something more profound related to how a project of the homely is made to stand only through the destruction of other homes. Such destruction is not outside of the settler colonial home, but right into it, a prerequisite for it. It's more intimate, to use Agar Kotev's word, is a more intimate object of violence. So the argument that I'm making starts with the traumatic experiences of living at the tail end of housing precarity and housing injustice, what we usually call homeless. And it is there where I will start. But its implications, as I said, are wider and are not just related to literatures and approaches concerning with the so-called homeless, but is a call for a renewed approach to the histories and geographies of habitation, colonizing our imagination and practices of home for what concerns me in the West. So I will start with Paolo. I met Paolo many years ago, in 2009, while I was working for my PhD project in Turin. At the time, Paolo was 40. Paolo was telling me about a therapeutic community for drug users located in Tuscany. He spent some time there in the early 2000s, and part of the story was about how he got hooked to heroin when the stuff was freely available on the road. Part of the story was about him smuggling cocaine for tourists traveling to Kenya. But there was also this affair of trying to get by in Turin, a city where he could sometimes afford to pay for shelter and sometimes he couldn't. Distributing flyers played a big role, he told me. Leafletting advertisements for a supermarket chain, a pizza joint, a new furniture shop that had just opened at the edge of town. Above him, a chain of commissioning, a boss who received the leaflets from another boss who got them from the company. And Paolo was extracting too. He had 3 employees whom he described to me as più fottuti di me, which means more fucked up than me. They worked a little, pretending mostly, and then threw the leaflets in the bins alongside the banks of the river Dora. The cast of life was very raw for Paolo. The showers in the homeless shelter of Biasaki shared with dozens of others, the nights without heating in the soffitta he managed to rent, a dark attic for which he needed no document, no proofs, only ready cash and enough balance to make it up the steep stairs without looking down the well, the cheap alcohol he drank, a trade-off for heroin, the lack of meaningful encounters. He once told me, it seems as if the only people I meet are people like me, e non abbiamo niente da dirci. We have nothing to say to each other. His body shaking, frail, cold. He loved making collages. He opened a Facebook account, made YouTube videos, delivering a peaceful message in search of a voice, a narrative that moved at his own tempo. Later on, when we both had left Turin, there was a rapprochement with his mother and a new woman he was now seeing whom he liked. He was living in a tiny garden shack in someone else's property, but his life was more serene. He could think about his passion for footballs and dogs. He was taking care of his own dwelling in his own world. Paolo, the heroin addict, the drunken, the boss, the dispossessed, the peer educator, the giver, the taker, the informant and friend, the sunburned hustler. Paolo the less. Paolo the homeless. Now, Paolo is the other of home. He lacks shelter. He lacks ontological security. He roams in a field of becoming populated with subjectivities that in the worst case are racialized, dispossessed, and jailed, while in the best case are rendered as subjects waiting to be studied and in need to be saved. One might ask, who does such a rendering? For Paolo clearly might have seen himself as someone lacking a proper dwelling and a just way of inhabiting planet Earth, but he did not see himself just as that. It is as if in order to make sense of Paolo's place in the world and in order to be able to deal with that place, as if something must be expelled from him. That such segmentation is there sounds obvious. Most here will have thought, well, of course, if the man needs housing, he must be dealt with as someone who needs that. We cannot deal with the rest. It would become unmanageable. Such thought process is at the core of the leading approaches to fix the homelessness issue. For example, the following text, the text you see here, shows how leading scholars of homelessness across the Atlantic, UK, US, and...
Right.
What?
Hello.
Sorry? Are you talking to me?
Michele, carry on, please.
Okay. So the text that you see here shows how leading scholars of homelessness across the Atlantic, UK, US, and Europe, how these people are working with, and all these people, are working with their own respective national governments. And these scholars are proposing to develop a global framework for conceptualizing and measuring homelessness. Now, I invite you to take a few seconds to read some of the text. And now my question to you is, who's who and what is expelled in order to extract what can be contained in such powerful framings? Here we are confronted with people living into tents, cheap hotels, streets, temporary accommodation cars, but never with people. Here we are confronted with a series of spotlights on specific points of a vast region in a move that renders the view of the overall structural and relational cartography not only impossible, but also unnecessary. And this is the problem. It is at the threshold of this last point of how things get dealt with, where I began to look at home and homelessness a bit differently. The epistemic and material creation of the other of home is not a side effect of something that went wrong at home, market failings, policy shortcomings, family breakings. And it is neither just a perverse form of revanchist control on deviant populations. Rather, it is home itself. It is violent. In this view, Paolo is no other to home. Paolo the homeless. It is always already at home. So in the book, I try to ask, would it be enough to shelter all the homeless in the world to end homelessness? Would it be enough to shelter Paolo to end his homelessness? Confronted with his struggles, the immediate answer would be a resounding yes. This is what humanitarian approaches, but also liberal approaches such as Housing First would argue. But answering yes to such a question means to avoid tackling the fundamental questions underpinning the possibility for Paolo to be made less in the first place. What is housing going to solve without a deeper questioning of the ways in which issues of class, consumption, mental health, migration, race, and construction of nationhood contribute to produce subjectivities made less, rendered as less, managed as less, worked out as less, jailed as less, who can only escape these entrapments as less, in further subtraction, either by hiding out or by taking their own life. Despite what common sense dictates, homelessness does not end with housing, and crucially, homelessness does not end at home. The same normative home that has expelled Paolo can take him back, continuing being all the same. That home, even in taking him back, would still bear all chances of making him redundant once more. Such a home cannot be the solution to homelessness. Such a home is a less, for it is founded on the possibility of its annihilation. So therefore, in my reading, home and homelessness are matter of the same. I invite to transcend the binary reading of the two and to speak instead of homelessness with the parenthesis, the common violent substratum through which home gets to replicate itself via processes of expulsion and extraction, of which I will say something in a moment. Talking of homelessness is to affirm that home contains in itself the possibility of not being at home. Home contains in itself the possibility of not being at home. Think of this. Can you imagine home without its other? This is what I call the impossible possibility of home. For one can be made to inhabit a space of the less without requiring home to alter its parameter, because the less is already part of home. It's not something else outside of it. Now, we're refusing to see home and homelessness as distinct. In refusing such distinction, I do not dismiss the different ways in which their same foundation is experienced. The experience of living rough or in a violent household or under the constant threat of addiction has experientially nothing in common with the privilege I am currently having as a white non-binary person, reading these notes to you, surrounded by people I love, with a working combi boiler in my house and a relatively stable mortgage backed by secure salary. Actually, I'm not sure if it is secure, but I think it is. Thinking about homelessness does not mean we are all homeless in the canonical sense of the word. Far from it, it means we are all at home. And the home is really violent and needs to be burned down, not adjusted, not fixed, but burned down. It means to say that the sharpest experiences of homelessness, including but not limited to sleeping rough, living in camps, prison, violent households, gendered and cis-normative spaces, and racialized lives, are not taking place in the realms separated from the idyllic pastures of safe homes, but are part of it. Put simply, home is not what saves from displacement and dispossession, but possible because it displaces and it dispossesses. So what is home all about then? If it does not grant salvation, what does it grant? Home, I argue in the book, is a colonial project. It is a matter of colonial production of subjects, spaces, affects, relations. Saying that home is a colonial project does not mean to flatten the discourse around settler colonialism, which clearly is very important here in Australia, and its specifics of land grabbing and occupation. But it is possible to recognize how the fundamental diagrams that play through the letter, through these settler colonial projects, are key to the inner constitutive dynamics of home too, even in contexts that are not settler colonial, such as Italy. As Said reminded us, for a colonial project to exist, something and someone needs to be occupied, and therefore to be constituted as worth being occupied. In the book, I work with Mezzadra and Nelson to show how the bordering of the homely works precisely in this sense. It is a diagram doing what Said has talked about through two concomitant moves. First, home, in order to stand, in order to exist in the world, also through housing, carves out a space for itself by defining an alterity. Imagine the most classic exemplification of this is the distinction between what is homely, what is home, and what is nature, what is wild, okay? Second, while keeping that alterity at bay, it constitutes a violent relationship with it, through which values, and when I say values here, I speak about various forms of values, such as cultural standing, sustenance, security, profit, belonging, can be extracted and become essential for the reproduction of home. So here I ask, what is home in contemporary racial capitalism without its otherness? How can its mainstream security, its belonging, its ecological, economic, gender, racial, and vitalist affordances, how can these things be maintained if one breaks through the definition and management of the alterity at the core of home? Now, answering this question requires identifying the effective and political economy of home more precisely. In the book, I expand on this in ways I cannot really do here. I discuss some of the colonies of home, such as the constitution of the homely via the creation of nature, and so the wild other, the constitution of the homely via the reproductive economy of patriarchal and the heteronormative, hence the creation of a specific femininity and gender binaries attached to a perceived feminine and masculine body, the constitution of a homely as a white space, and of a national whiteness in the case I investigate, Italy, vis-a-vis the creation and management of the black other, as well, of course, the capacity of capitalist flows to intersect all of these things and make them work in productive ways to generate value, albeit the generation of value exceeds capitalist processes. Think, for instance, of the charitable value of loving the poor, which is very much central in a context such as that of Italy, where the Catholic Church has really built an empire about saving the poor and bringing the poor back home. So if I don't have time here to explore these multiple borders, I want to spend a few minutes to highlight the conceptual grammar I propose in the text to understand what unites them, what unites the different borders, what kind of operation unites the colonial project of home. Getting closer to the borders of home, one can hear a sound of something expelled and yet kept close, the rhythm of a movement that can change form but maintains a tempo across bordering practices to sustain the homelessness threshold. What is home, what is not home? At the bare minimum, the key feature of such a refrain, a ritornello, as I say in the book, seems to revolve around two functions, which in the book, echoing traditions spanning from Marxist to feminist and critical race thinking, I identify as expulsion and extraction. So for me, expulsion and extraction are these baseline functions that are cutting through several processes through which the border of home, the productive bordering device of the what is home and what is not home, is maintained in contemporary racial capitalism. So expulsion denotes a double-faced segmentation. It is a cutting off of the other, which entails its creation as other. And now this is conceptual, but then I will give you a couple of examples in a few minutes. On the one hand, expulsion creates a normative assemblage via selectively deciding what belongs and what is made to fit. On the other hand, it engages in the process of othering, silencing, and erasing that which doesn't fit, which comes to be defined against the exclusionary norm. Now, as I always say, and I hope she wouldn't mind, this is not Saskia Sassen expulsion, okay? So it's not about, trashing people out. This is not what I'm saying. There is a segmentation taking place in expulsion, which is a relationship with the other, is the constitution of the other and the maintenance of the relationship with the other. So expulsion works through segmentations intersecting multiple planes of subjectivity. As we have seen before, the rough sleeper, for instance, is created by reducing an entire life. Remember that table, okay? Is created, the idea of the rough sleeper, the notion of the rough sleeper, by reducing an entire life to a codified experience, which is in part expelled from home and in part at the same time made available for further operations. Clearly, this does not mean to say that the intense experience of sleeping rough with all its trauma and material hardness is a simple epistemological creation. This is not what I'm saying, but it means to say that through that experience, which is very real, an epistemological colonization takes place, which is also a political act. It is about reducing the complexity of that experience to a given quantity, sleeping on cars, sleeping on benches, sleeping in shelters, right? From which extraction of value can take place. And also academic value, right? Of writing and dealing with those kind of experiences. Now, on this particular threshold, the threshold of expulsion, the threshold where the other is created by segmenting life, by reducing life to a manageable quantity, on the threshold of expulsion, extraction is operated. Now, expulsion and extraction always go hand in hand. It's not that you have one and you don't have the other. They are a refrain. They cut through multiple bordering devices of the homely. The value that is extracted through expulsion includes a broad set of social, cultural, and economic assets. These can include social affirmation, parental authority. What parents do with kids is a form of expulsion and extraction. Moral justification, accrual of epistemic privilege, as I said, like the job we do in the academy, sexual pleasure and profiteering. Expulsion and extraction are those two functions made to work across the land of lessness in order to maintain and reproduce home in its current fashion. An impossible possibility founded in defining its otherness and in extracting legitimacy and power from it. Now, following Guattari, I call their work a ritornello because they are recursive, and then also because they are not simply a script. The way they take place changes vis-a-vis the subjective maps, histories, and geographies they interlace with. So, for instance, what I'm showing you here in this slide is a very powerful form of extraction in the Italian context. Maybe doesn't apply to the Australian one for the maintenance of the Australian home, but it doesn't really matter because what I'm talking about here is a methodology to understand expulsion and extraction. It's not just a specific case. Now, there are multiple of these operations of expulsion and extraction at home. The homely as in opposition to, but in vital relationship with what is constituted as nature, as I said. The ontological secure vis-a-vis the other, the power of man as a cis normative carving out of power from women and who is not adequately man, and so on. So in the book, I explore these productive borderings, but I then ground the analysis on the case of Italy and on a ritornello that I identify following the late Umberto Eco when he discussed the notion of fascism or eternal fascism. For Eco, the Italian Resistenza won the battle against the fascist regime, but not against a much deeper cultural fascism that he defines as fascism. And here I'm quoting Eco, a series of characteristics including machismo, cult of tradition, appeal to the frustrated middle classes, fear of difference, contempt of the weak. Here I see the lexicon of patriarchy and racialized class formations, which I talk about in the book. Now here I don't have, so in the book I deal with this kind of, I excavate this kind of expulsion and extraction in Italy by looking at things such as papal speeches, fascist colonial documents, contemporary laws and popular culture on top of my ethnographic work. Here I cannot really expand on this too much. I'm just going to give you a brief example on the racial capitalist ritornello of the Italian home. The racialized link between land, law, and blood becomes the structure of today's Italian homes and a means to defend it vis-a-vis the wilderness of the Black other. This is a bordering process going back to Mussolini, through which, as Camilla Hawthorne has argued, and here I'm quoting Camilla, African bodies are remarked as iconic signifiers of illegitimate belonging, suggesting that their very being in an Italian place threatens the moral purity of the nation state, end quote. In the book, I trace the lineage of the racist Italian home, starting with the fascist colonial project, as well as through the writings of Catholic popes, which is really fun shit, but I have no time here to illustrate. So a telling example here is related to citizenship. Even after the demise of the fascist regime, the state reaffirmed that legal belonging was possible only on the basis of jus sanguinis, by which citizenship is transmitted only from parent or ascendant in possession of citizenship themselves, therefore providing for the continuation of the whitening principles inscribed by the racial colonial state to date. Now, following Valeria De Plano, by maintaining the same inclusion and exclusion criteria devised in 1912, with all the racist undercurrents, the nascent Republic of Italy became a state that was still heavily imbued with colonialist culture. Citizenship here works as a bordering process through which, as Camilla Otto argued, as I said before, African bodies are remarked as iconic signifier of illegitimate belongings. Now, it is not only that all Black others are banned, but their selective inclusion takes place through an act of expulsion. If they can accept the racial script, leaving out what is not needed, homely Italian belongings may be enjoyed. Such expulsion is, of course, productive. It reinforces a whitened discourse of Italianness, it creates political legitimacy, it activates economic profit-making. It suffices to say that the Meloni government has extracted much value in mobilizing the Black other as a threat she needs to legitimize a certain kind of action, but keeps at bay by jailing it. I want to give you two concrete examples of how this extraction of value from expulsion of the Black other works and how it ties into the basic grammar of the Italian home. The first is related to the provision of cheap labor to serve the national culinary needs. As an economy of subject made not to belong formally in order to be forced to work illegally. Here I'm referring to the agro-mafia business, a form of illegal recruitment of workers very common in the production of vegetables and in particular in the picking of tomatoes in the southern regions of Italy. In the Apulia region during peak season, there are around 15,000 such illegal workers. Salaries are not paid by the hour, but related to how many boxes of tomato one can fill. Reports say €3 for a 375 kilo box of tomato. Water, food, and transportation are charged to the worker, who often lives in abandoned factories, shacks, and tents for the entire working season. These are the homeless, right? Through this, Italy can maintain its standing as the second biggest producer of tomatoes in the world, and the Italian home can enjoy its whitened heteronormative pasta seasoned with cheap pomodoro sauce. Now, I will leave the heteronormative there for a second. We can discuss about it later. Now, such system is an expulsive extractive diagram of power working through a double elision. On the one hand, there is the disappearance of labor. Tomatoes arrive in the Italian home without signs of the traumatic becoming inscribed in them. On the other hand, there is the social disappearance of the migrants, never seen or heard, and those requests to belong is systematically rejected by the state. As the sociologist Gennaro Vallone argued, migrant workers are reproduced as alien, extraneous, absent subjects, although very present, and this is the key, present for production, absent for everything else. The second diagram of extraction is related to the asylum seeker reception system. For those who do not request asylum, or for those to whom asylum status is, refugee status, is denied, there are the permanence and repatriation centers, CPR. One of the first encounters I had when moving back to Italy 3 years ago was with the story of Moussa Bal, the 23-year-old Ghanaian man who migrated to Italy in 2017. His story is very complex, however, the ending is tragically straightforward. On Sunday, May 23, 2021, Moussa took his life in Turin's CPR. And this is very common, by the way. He hanged himself in the cell where he had been locked up a few days earlier as the result of his arrest by police in Ventimiglia in the Liguria region. He was arrested after he was beaten up by a group of 3 fascists in the city streets on May 9. The fascists got away free, but Moussa was detained, because the police, while escorting him to the hospital, found out that his resident permit had expired. For this reason, after only 10 days of hospital care, he was moved into the CPR in Turin. Local activists were able to speak to some of the other inmates, and one of them confirmed that despite showing clear signs of suffering caused by injuries on his body, Moussa was never examined by a doctor or a member of the medical staff at the CPR. Moussa was trying to find a place to inhabit in Italy after being entrapped in the perverse logic of asylum procedures, then being beaten for the color of his skin, then jailed, then put in isolation, then denied medical care. In an interview recorded in 2018, not long after his arrival in the country, he stated his desire for habitation. Here I'm quoting Moussa: "I would like to stay in Italy because in this country I have had a taste of how beautiful life can be. I would like to study in order to find a good job and live well." Unquote. Now, the boundaries of the Italian home are not designed to give space to the desire of habitation of the migrant worker, the asylum seekers like Moussa, the conventionally homeless like Paolo, but also to so many other subjectivities made less at the intersection of heteronormativity, patriarchy, racism, ecological disaster, class struggle, ableism, and more. The purpose of the boundaries of the homely is precisely to shut down such desire, not simply because of an ephemeral or transitory political will, but because the foundations of home are deeper and speak to the wider and shared racialized and nationalist earth fascism of which Eco was writing about. The violent logics of the Italian home extends itself beyond the household and come back there in a fold to work as the ultimate border in practice for a form of ontological security. Is my ontological security, your ontological security, but grounded in past and present colonial histories, are now characterized not only by pasta, mortgages, baptism, and marriages, but also by the figure of the hanged black person in a detention center, or that of the refugee awaiting asylum riding around circles on a bike. They have been refused citizenship, refused ground, defined as unwelcome, and yet, once again, this is crucial, kept close by to feed and to justify homes where they will never belong, but that need them to stand on their rotten foundation. So, on this basis, I want to conclude by asking, how can this kind of home pretend to save its other? I didn't say much about saving. Maybe we can discuss this in the Q&A. But saving is crucial in Italy because of the Catholic underpinning of the country. How can this kind of home pretend to save its other? Why should the subject, like Paolo, that is made to experience expulsion in order to become a value asset of the homely through extraction, be brought back home? The problem here is not just with the creation of such a subject, the poor, the refugee, the homeless, the queer, But with what that subject is made to do, my book ultimately is a critique of homeless service provision. What state, religious, and humanitarian institutions do with that subject is the crux of the issue of the colonial project of home. On the one hand, they could disrupt the continuity between the home that has expelled them and the one that is supposed to take them back. That would mean directly tackling the ritornello's structuring home. It would not mean to house all the homeless of the world to solve homelessness. In fact, in the book, and just opening a parenthesis, I take stances at the policy of housing first, as I was telling yesterday, because even in housing first, housing does not come first. In housing first, what comes first is a medicalized viewpoint on how to save the homeless other, and it's a liberal ideology that in order to fix homelessness, you need to find individualized solutions. And we can talk about this. So solving homelessness would not mean to house all the homeless of the world. It would mean in the quintessential restoration of housing, because here I'm working in housing justice framework, quintessential restoration of housing, it would mean to challenge the expulsive and extractive logics of nationalism and racial capitalism, to cite just the processes evoked today. Otherwise, the other option is for the institutions managing the other to continue to do what they do, including the academy, including the table you saw before, to reproduce and maintain the multiple alternatives of home without altering the basic formula of their control, even when they manage to shelter the other. And so the book offers a proposition for a more radical kind of endeavor, radical because it can be appropriated. Home must not be fixed. The other of home must not be saved. Home needs instead to be liberated. Coherently with the need to produce affirmations to get beyond the binaries of lessness, of what is made less, I defined liberated as that break to allow for an emancipatory desire of habitation to emerge and take place in the world. Such a capacity is not the end point of a revolutionary effort. It cannot be given by the state, but is the ongoing struggle to affirm that another way of inhabiting the world is possible. And so in the third part of the book, I illustrate what an initial strategy in this sense might entail. There are three moves towards a liberated kind of home, which I would like to recall here to conclude. These are what I call the institution, reinstitution, and institution. And I'm working with, again, queer and feminist frameworks in order to describe these kind of moves. Now, first, the institution through the practice of striking. If I am in conversation with feminist and queer thinkers and doers throughout the book, it is at this point that I find inspiration in particular from the work of Veronica Gago. The focus here is on deinstitutionalizing and fighting against the industries currently caring or studying the other of home, which include much of the current service provision for the homeless, as well as knowledge production around them. So I call for the total deinstitution of homelessness services provision as we know it today, but also homelessness scholarship, which is for the most a pile of useless and dangerous crap anyway. Deinstitutionalizing service provision is not something to be done through the funding. So I'm not calling for the funding. I'm calling for more funding through the framework of abolition. A move that indeed will require more funding, care, and dedication. Deinstitutionalization through abolition. The goal is to stop the circuit of value extraction from the other, which requires creation and control of the other to enable situated intervention tackling the multiple violences of home. Second, to arrive there, the second move would be reinstitution through radical caring. Here, clearly, I can only say it very briefly, I cannot unpack it. Here, the focus is on allowing ourselves to relearn how to care for habitation and its struggles, and to continue on that basis, on that basis, a universal approach to housing focused on dwellers' control. The apparent resonance of this point with some current progressive policies, as I said, like housing first, is demystified in the book. In my approach, housing comes not first, because housing comes not first even in housing first. In restitution, what is instituted again is housing, yes, but as a project to learn for and of habitation. Thinking with UK housing anarchists and the Italian operaisti, I centered the practice of autonomy as central to such endeavor. And then finally, at that threshold, institution through affirmation. This last move is focused on considering occupation and grassroots organizing as a viable alternative to interventions focused on policy change. Institution is therefore about bypassing state inertia and prefiguratively enacting liberatory politics of home in the here and the now. As someone vetted to an autonomous thinking, and as a person more and more grounded in queer understanding of the world, I do not intend the institution to be a plan, a solution for all. Affirmation is a practice to and by communities, to and by individuals, and not a planetary theory or grand plan. And here I'm closing. It is easier to keep a binary reading of home and homelessness. It's way easier to assume that, all considered, home is better than nothing, and that we might be able to incrementally fix it. But such a posture carries an epistemic and material colonial violence that we must reject. The praxis of the instituting, reinstituting, and instituting can be already found in forms of collective organizing, squatting, and community-based direct action. Their strength lies in rejecting ideas of a fix for all, in avoiding a fidelity scale. Liberation from homelessness, in this sense, will not consist in a new home. It will be the intensification of struggles against expulsion and extraction, leading to thousands different ways of doing home. In such a view, no formation can be considered entirely safe, not for all. No arrangement and no design can accommodate once and for all. Here is the point where we can finally go back to Hooks, where home really becomes an open-ended process, a place which enables and promotes varied and ever-changing perspectives, a place where one discovers new ways of seeing reality, frontiers of difference. This definition of Hooks is important because it unsettles the fixity of home. Such a homely place, to be coherent with its definition, can only be an ongoing revolution, a liberatory home in praxis leading to a variety of forms, a multiplicity of housing use values, united by guiding principles pointing beyond expulsion and extraction. From my limited vantage point, I have mentioned three: the refusal of controlling so-defined homeless others, the need to center differential ways of caring about our capacity to constantly redoing home, and the practice of constituting affirmative ways of working through the unjust, violent grounds of the lessness, the violent making less we all currently inhabit. But here I stop, and I think we can continue with conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michele, for such a deeply philosophical provocation, scrutinizing the very idea of home, in some way also unsettling the very notion of home, and perhaps also rejecting the very sort of like that material home, perhaps fully from that conception of home. So first, I guess, I mean, we could go from here, who are here present in person, perhaps some questions we can take from the room, and then we'll move to the online space. So if you are joining us online and have a question, please raise your hand, and then when asked, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Anybody from the room?
I'll have a go if you want.
Please, Kim.
Michele has disappeared. There he is. Thank you very much, Michele, for that presentation. It was really provocative and really interesting. The point where you end with a quote from Bell Hooks is interesting. Because she describes home twice there as a place and as a kind of an open place, that's open to new ways of thinking and so on. And I was reminded when you were talking of this long-standing debate in geography and elsewhere over the questions of place, which raises that other lessness, which was the placelessness, that debate that emerged really maybe 30 years ago, really about a dispute between closed and open senses of place with Doreen Massey and others, and that was, I think, fairly fully resolved in a kind of direction towards a more open sense of place. And the idea that placelessness was really one person's version of another's sense of place, if you like. Are there parallels between the way in which you're trying to deal with homelessness and that older debate about placelessness?
Thank you. Ash, do you want me to answer each question? Do you want to?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is an excellent point. Thank you very much. Yeah, in the book, I start my definition of, I start to unpack home precisely with Doreen Massey, because Doreen Massey had a piece many years ago, I think 93, something like that, where she was asking the question of the place we call home. So precisely what you're talking about. I think the inspiration I take from that work is that the place of home is always enmeshed in translocal power geometries. So for me, it was very important to go back to the Italian colonial history, which is a fraught history. It's a small colonial empire, completely. It lasted only a few years, but it was important to go back to that history and to those spaces and places in order to speak about the contemporary Italian home. And I think I get that from Massey. It's like it's about, you know, the place, the ways in which certain kind of people are made placeless, without place, is very much attached to this kind of translocal and longitudinal power geometries. So no, absolutely, I'll take it more as a comment, but yeah, that work is fundamental.
Thank you, Michele. Any question from the room?
I have one.
Yeah, please go ahead, Alison.
Hi, Michele. Thank you for your presentation. I'm just sort of riffing, I guess, around the question that Kim asked, and how perhaps what might be distinctive about the question of homelessness is the fact that it has become attached to a specific group of people, the homeless, and that this is understood in various now quite well entrenched ways within societies, and it leads to all sorts of consequences for them. And that might not be the same in relation to the place and placelessness debate, where like we don't really think of people as placeless so much as we find it easier to think of people as homeless. And I'm thinking also of the way you start your book, where you talk about the Samuel Beckett short story, which focuses on a kind of formless shape of an individual within an undifferentiated grey plateau, and that you argue that this is what has become our sense of the homeless subject. Can you say anything more about that and why that image has been so important for your work, and how it helps you understand the need to, as you said, I wrote down, burn down the home, and also the need to kind of burn down the housing service sector?
Thank you so much, Alison, for giving me the opportunity to clarify a few things. So this is an excellent question. Now, the real thing I'm trying to do here is to say that what we conventionally understand as the homeless is not to be found outside of home. The problem here is that there is this impossible possibility of the home. Why I said impossible possibility? Because on the one hand, home offers a possibility. It's the possibility of belonging. It's the possibility of ontological security. It's the possibility of shelter. And this stays. It's there. I'm not getting rid of that. I'm saying that that possibility, though, is founded upon an impossible premise. What is the impossible premise? Is that you can lose all of that. Because if you grow up in a violent household, I mean, you are sheltered, but really, what kind of ontological security you have? If you come to Italy as Musa seeking asylum, you may be sheltered in a community, but what kind of belonging do you have? So in a sense, the possibility of home is always there. And it's also there because we long for it. It's like, you know, and we cited this yesterday in the workshop, Will Smith's pursuit of happiness, right? It gets out of the street because it imagines, it does have this particular pull to go back home, right? But the problem again, that this pull, this lure of home sits on a rotten foundation, because that home will make you redundant once more. And this is for something that is very evident when you have been made subject of the less to start with, when you are a racialized subject, when you are a queer subject, when you are a subject that does not formally belong, like Musa. So for all the subjects of the less, the impossible possibility of home, it's like a daily thing. Now, what I'm trying to say here, what I'm trying to do here, is that the services that are brought to the fore in order to fix, so to speak, some of this lessness, are reproducing the same logic, the same impossible possibility of home. Because they require that subject to be segmented in a certain way in order to become manageable. Now, it's not simply that I'm saying, let's close the shelters and do nothing, right? We close shelters and we solve the problem. That's stupid. It's not what I'm saying, right? It's about saying we need to take this problem seriously. We need to bring the problem back home. We need to rethink what it means to belong. Because if our form of belonging in housing, through housing, the constitution of the homely, is based on the premise that it constantly requires the creation of an otherness to be managed in order to stand, then we do have an impossible possible problem. We do have a big issue here. And just to conclude, I want to say that I purposely start the book with the conventional homeless, let's say Paolo, the rough sleeper, right? What you see in that big table of these big thinkers of homelessness, right? But then I try to expand and to look beyond, because the problem that unites Paolo and Musa is not shelter. It's not that the problem, because both find shelter eventually. The problem that unites Paolo and Musa is that they are made subject of the less in order for the Italian home to work the way it works, based on Catholic charity, based on the enslavement of people to pick tomatoes, and so on and so forth. So I didn't say anything about Beckett, but the thing with Beckett is that, you know, that little story he wrote, Sons, is a very powerful one, because essentially in that story, you can rearrange the sentences and the story still makes sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense to start with, it's Beckett, but in a sense, it does make sense. And you can pick the sentences and you can rearrange the sentences the way you want, and the story still makes sense. And it's a story about this gray subject inhabiting this plateau where, you know, all sorts of things happen. Like there is wind, there is sun, there is an excruciating life experience, right? Now we are conventionally made to think that that thing is different from home, that that thing is the absence of home. And somewhat we can fix that plateau. We can rearrange things and we can construct something different. And what I'm taking the argument against is that you can rearrange everything, but unless you rewrite the story entirely, not simply rearranging the sentences, you are not getting out of homelessness, right? That's why I found that particular little story from Beckett evocative, beyond the fact that coincidentally speaks about the less.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. Maybe, I mean, this is just 5 o'clock, so any last question from here or online?
I have a very brief question. Thank you so much, Michele, for the presentation. Really appreciate it. I would like to know from your perspective, given the conceptualization of our home and homelessness work that you've been doing over the years, do you think that everyone, irrespective of where you find yourself, has one point in their life been homeless?
Thank you, Patrick. If I can call you by first name, that's an excellent question. I think everyone at some point in their life have been home, and that's where the problem is. So in a sense, you know, what I'm saying here is not that we are all homeless, because that would actually be a very dangerous argument to make, simply because there are so many houseless and homeless folks that are building their own politics of resistance precisely by embracing their experience of houselessness and, you know, kind of wearing that label in order to organize. I'm thinking about also people doing poverty scholarship around it. So if I say that we are all homeless, I'm actually detracting from those experiences. This is not what I'm saying. I'm saying those experiences are part of the ways in which you and I constitute our home in our societies. So instead of saying, you know, at some point in life, everyone will be or has been homeless, what I'm saying is that is potentially, it can potentially happen because it's structured within the logic of home, okay? Because home, and I'm talking about the Italian context, I'm talking about the West, so I don't want to talk about every context, right? Because home is rotten in its foundations. Because the way it once Vanessa Castonbrotto, a colleague from Sheffield, she said something very beautiful. She said that housing mediates our relationship with the universe. And it's a powerful figure if you think about it, right? Housing mediates our relationship with the universe. Now, I am asking what kind of mediation housing and homing do. And the outcome of my research is essentially saying is a mediation that constantly requires for the homeless other to be produced. So yeah, I would leave it there. Maybe I didn't answer, but thank you for your good point, Patrick.
And the very last question from this session, yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks, Michele. I just had a genealogical question. If this has been a permanent state of differentiation between the homeless and the homeless, or is there that changes through time, or like a periodization that we're living in a particular moment of this happening, or it has particular characteristics at this time, or because it is a temporal or like an atemporal dynamic that's always been a function?
Thank you for the question. I think what I'm trying to do in the book is to provide a kind of a double contribution. On the one hand, there is a contribution that is specific to Italy. So I can answer your question in relation to that. I can say, for instance, that one crucial moment in the definition of the contemporary Italian home and the ways in which that home is structured around patriarchal lines is the Council of Trento in 1500s, where the definition of the sanctity of marriage took place. And I analyze papal encyclicas in order to trace genealogically how from that moment on, the Council of Trento was essentially the answer of the Catholic Church against the Reform. From that moment on, how it trickled down to our days. For instance, in the latest speeches of Pope Francis around gender and the problem of gender ideologies, right? So there is a specificity, and I think I genealogically I start there for the Italian context, and that is one of the threshold of the home and what is not home, the queer other, that is very important to me. And the other contribution is more general and it's methodological. So I'm not, for instance, in relation to Australia, I couldn't make any point. I couldn't answer really your question, but what I'm trying to provide is also a methodology to ask the question. The methodology is to say there are multiple borders that sustain home and are needed by home in order to stand. And I'm looking at these through these notions of expulsion and extraction and the constitutive relationship of these notions. And that is a methodology that I think can be adapted, can be taken, can be restructured for different kind of contexts. So for the more general answer, I will stop there because it's a fraught terrain, right? History and geography do matter, yeah.
Right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, everybody. I mean, we had a large crowd, around 50 participants online, and here we had around 12, 15 participants. So thank you, everybody, for joining this session. And can we have a grand round of applause for Michele? And those who are here, and if you are also around the campus, and if you want to join us to keep with the InfUr legacy, we are heading to the Clyde for a drink, I mean, post-seminar drink, and please join us there. Michele, we'll miss you definitely there.
I'm very sorry.
Oh, well, yep.
But thank you, Ash. Thank you, everyone. Once again, thanks, Alison, for her generosity to bring me here. And hopefully I'll see you, Ash and Alison, tomorrow. I'm sorry I couldn't make it in the room today, but I think it was better this way.
It went well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, all the participants. Thank you for your time.
Bye, everybody.